Matt Walker explains the relationship between sleep and memory.
Inherent within this conundrum, for me at least, are three critical ingredients that we must appreciate. The first critical ingredient is the fact that your brain does not reside in a homogeneous state across the 24-hour period. In fact, your brain will actually oscillate through a variety of different, what we call brain states, going from being awake to being asleep, even into different stages of sleep. And that's an important point. We actually do have different types of sleep. And so to sort of break that apart, human sleep is broadly being classified into two main types, as many of you may know. On the one hand, we have non-rapid eye movement sleep, or non-REM sleep. And non-REM sleep has been further subdivided into four separate stages, increasing in their depth of sleep. So stages 3 and 4 is that really sort of deep restorative sleep, that dreamless sleep. Whilst on the other hand, we have rapid eye movement sleep, or REM sleep, named not after the popular Michael Stipe band, but because of these rather bizarre horizontal shuttling eye movements that occur during this stage of sleep. That's the first critical ingredient out of the three to this question. The second critical ingredient to keep in mind is that just as sleep is not homogeneous, nor is memory. Because human memory has been the subject of a variety of classification systems. And probably the most popular of these sort of taxonomies is the separation of what we call declarative memory from non-declarative memory. That which you can declare verbally versus that which you have to show through action and behavior. The final ingredient to keep in mind is that just as memory is not sort of monolithic, nor are the different stages that create and sustain memories. You first form a memory or encode a memory by engaging with the information. And that could be listening to a lecture or learning a new piano piece. But by engaging with that information, what we believe happens is that the brain forms a representation of that information, what we call a memory representation. But after that memory has first been born, so to speak, it's actually very fragile and very vulnerable to being overwritten or interfered with for example, competing information. So for that new memory to persist long term, it has to pass through a second step that we call memory consolidation. And that's this sort of slow, iterative process where the brain essentially solidifies that new memory into the neural architecture of the brain, thereby making it less vulnerable to being lost. Sleep after learning is important to firstly strengthen and consolidate individual memories. And here we're going to be talking about motor skill memories. And the task that we developed in the laboratory was very much like learning to play a piano scale. So you as the participant would come into the lab and you'd have to learn on a computer keyboard using your left non-dominant hand a 5-digit sequence such as 41324. And you have to type that out over and over again for periods of 30 seconds, and then you get to rest for 30 seconds, and we call that a single trial. And then we have you sort of learn or acquire that motor skill by performing 12 trials of back-to-back training. And then at some later point in time, we're going to bring you back into the lab, and we're going to retest you on just 2 or 3 trials. And we're going to ask the question, relative to the end of your training session, at that later retest in time, has your performance improved? Has it stayed the same? Or has it become worse? As a measure of how well your brain has been able to consolidate or perhaps lose and forget that memory. And we can measure that with certain variables, things like speed and accuracy. So what we were really interested in trying to figure out in this experiment was, yes, the brain may need time to slowly sort of strengthen those memories, but is it just time? Or is it time awake? Or is it time with sleep? And to sort of separate those three out, we designed 2 basic experiments, what we call the wake first and the sleep first experiment. So in the wake first experiment, participants come into the lab, and these are all young, healthy people that we test, and they perform those 12 trials of training that I spoke about. And that's that thick green arrow there representing those 12 trials. And then after 12 hours across the day, we bring them back, and we test them on those just 2 or 3 trials. And then following a further 12 hours that contains a full 8-hour night of sleep, we test them for a second time. Whilst in the sleep first experiment, we just reverse that timing. So now they perform their training in the evening. 12 hours later, but immediately after sleep, we test them for a first time. And then after a further 12 hours later that second day, we test them for a second time. What you're looking at here on that vertical axis is motor skill speed, the number of correctly typed sequences per 30-second trial. Now, by the end of the training session in the morning, those in the wake first experiment had improved significantly, which is not surprising. Practice, you're led to believe, makes perfect. But if you bring them back 12 hours across the day, what you find is that there's no real further significant improvement in performance. They're not worse, they're just not significantly better. But if you bring them back after a further 12 hours that contained a night of sleep, what you see is a remarkable delayed offline memory boost of almost 20% in terms of performance speed. In fact, there's a near 30% improvement in accuracy. It could simply be that your brain just requires more than 12 hours to sort of be working on these memories. And so it's got nothing to do with sleep, it's just getting past 12 hours. So it's just time that the brain is requiring. Well, we can test that hypothesis in the sleep first group. As you remember, they were trained in the evening, and they too improved with practice. But when we tested them just 12 hours later, but once again following sleep, straight away we see that offline memory boost. Yet when you bring them back after a further 12 hours later that second day, there's no further change in performance. So in other words, following training, your brains will continue to learn in the absence of any further practice. It's really quite magical in some ways. However, that delayed learning occurs exclusively across periods of sleep and not across equivalent time periods while you're awake. In fact, regardless of whether the time awake or the time asleep comes first.